The critical theory of deconstructionism is a theory of all time and the practice of literary interpretation. It seems that the point of deconstructionism is to show us that we do not really know anything that we thought we knew. This interpretive practice works by pulling on a loose thread until the entire shirt unravels. Another metaphor: no matter how sound a structure, it will collapse if enough bricks are pulled out. No work of literature is entirely consistent. The danger of deconstructionism lies in the ability of the deconstructionist to disprove whatever thesis concerning a text she wishes. At what point does the exercise of this power become abuse? If exercised reasonably, the theory of deconstructionism has its proper use. It can add to the richness and fullness of our understanding of a text. The character of Gandalf in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings has often been compared to Jesus Christ. Casual readers and critics alike are quick to point out the similarities between the two. Both take on the role of mentor, leader, and guide. Both sacrifice themselves to save others. Both miraculously return. Joseph Pearce, Craig Bernthal, Fleming Rutledge, Philip Ryken, Mark Eddy Smith, and a bunch of other people you probably have never heard of, all explicitly claim that Gandalf exhibits Christ-like attributes. I would like to challenge the idea of identifying Gandalf as a Christ figure. Doing so makes The Lord of the Rings into an allegory, which unnecessarily limits the meaning of the text. Tolkien himself wrote in many different places that he disliked allegory and sought to avoid it. In the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes, "As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical." He also discusses allegory repeatedly throughout his letters, in every instance speaking of his wishes to evade it. Tolkien's opinion concerning his own writing is not the only opinion that matters, or even the most important opinion. Yet it still matters, at least a little bit, especially considering the placement of The Lord of the Rings in Tolkien's lifelong work of creating and developing the history of Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings has its place in the legendarium. It also stands on its own. It is a part of a larger story, but also a self-enclosed and self-sufficient text. Exclusively viewing this book in one way or another limits the potential meaning of the text. It is both a solitary work and a part of a larger whole. Gandalf plays a pivotal role in the story of The Lord of the Rings. At various times, he acts the part of counselor, messenger, warrior, and guide. His wisdom, courage, and sacrificial acts inspire his companions to great heights. It seems only natural to compare Gandalf to Christian saints, and even Jesus Christ. Indeed, many Tolkien scholars have made that exact connection. Mark Eddy Smith writes, "But Gandalf is not their leader so much as their friend, and like Jesus, he has the love that will lay down his life for his friends." In a similar vein, Craig Bernthal writes, "Tolkien's model for Gandalf is certainly Jesus, whose sternness is often overlooked in Christian sentimentality, but whose kindness has an iron backbone." Echoing Smith and Bernthal, Fleming Rutledge states, "The ring-bearer escapes because, at the crucial juncture, Gandalf interposes himself between Frodo and the demon. It is another Christ-like moment." I do not necessarily disagree with the content of what any of these authors have claimed. However, these characterizations of Gandalf are rather one-sided, and thus limiting. We can admire the character of Gandalf as a model of courage and self-sacrifice, but we cannot relate to or empathize with him. He is a model according to which we measure ourselves, not a companion in the development of virtue. I aim to use deconstructionalist theory to show how the parallel between Gandalf and Jesus Christ breaks down. The danger I must avoid is triviality. Of course, Gandalf is not a perfect analog of Christ. I intend to show how the dissimilarities between the two figures are crucial to understanding the character of Gandalf. A benefit of adjusting our view of Gandalf is that we can finally view him as a person. In Tolkien's legendarium as a whole, Gandalf is a Maya, a sort of spirit or angel who has a physical form. He is not human, and thus we should not expect him to have human characteristics. However, The Lord of the Rings exists as a standalone work. Who says we can only read it in the context of Tolkien's entire history of Middle-earth? Within this text, we have no information concerning the origin of Gandalf, nothing to indicate what sort of being he is. We have a choice regarding how we view his character. In one sense, Gandalf is a greater-than-human hero who approaches the level of a god in power, wisdom, and goodness. In another, and equally important and legitimate sense, Gandalf is a personal character in a story, as full of flaws and shortcomings as ourselves. Gandalf is more than a symbol or a superhuman hero. He is a man, weighed down by the troubles of the world, yet never giving up no matter how hopeless his situation becomes. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, we receive hints of Gandalf's shortcomings, including his own self-assessments. Two notable examples are his underestimation of the cleverness and resourcefulness of Gollum, and his surprise at Saruman's betrayal. At the Council of Elrond, Gandalf openly admits to his faults. There I was at fault. I was lulled by the words of Saruman the Wise. His naivete allowed Saruman to ensnare and imprison him on top of the Tower of Orthanc. A few lines later he says, "Gollum came, but he escaped and was not found. And then alas, I let the matter rest, watching and waiting only, as we have too often done." His lack of foresight allowed him to be outwitted by the creature Gollum, causing a loss of precious time. His comment at the end of his speech points to more flaws. Gandalf, it seems, is prone to the vice of sloth. He is slow to action, even when that action would be beneficial. It is a sloth born out of excessive caution and even perhaps fear, the fear of failure. In the same speech, Gandalf tells of yet another mistake. "I stayed the night in Bree, deciding that I had no time to return to the Shire. Never did I make a greater mistake." This error in judgment cost Gandalf precious time and caused much trouble for Frodo. Gandalf is the first to admit his own faults. For all his wisdom and intelligence, he is not infallible. On the contrary, he often errs, and his errors have the habit of affecting many people. Gandalf's responsibility and power exacerbate the effects of his faults. The Tolkien scholar Farid Mohammadi points out that Gandalf often resorts to manipulation in order to get others to do what he wants, for the greater good, of course, but this naturally raises the question of whether the ends justify the means. In the end, everything works out for the best, but could not the same results have been accomplished if Gandalf had been more forthcoming and less controlling? Gandalf says, "But I spoke yet of my dread to none, knowing the peril of an untimely whisper if it went astray." He keeps his counsel to himself, and encounters troubles because of his closed-mouthness. Mohammadi provides a much-needed examination of the flaws of Gandalf. He is one of the few Tolkien scholars to take note of the darker side of Gandalf. Gandalf's sacrificial death and miraculous return beg the comparison with Jesus Christ. Gandalf's own understanding of what happened to him is unclear. Even he does not know the full story. In one of his letters, Tolkien tells us that the supreme deity of Middle-earth, Eru Ilúvatar, brought Gandalf back to life after he perished during the battle with the Balrog. Whether or not we accept this addition as part of the story, we do see a significant shift in the character of Gandalf. In the words of Mary, Gandalf has grown or something. He can be both kinder and more alarming, merrier and more solemn than before, I think. He has changed, but we have not had a chance to see how much yet. I do not see it as hurtful to compare this transformation to the glorification of Jesus Christ post-resurrection. However, we can just as legitimately view it as the mere result of dying and being resurrected. Such an experience is bound to dramatically change someone. Regardless, there is a marked difference between Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White, whereas the Christian scriptures go to some length establishing that the resurrected Jesus Christ is identical to pre-crucifixion Jesus Christ. The Christian scriptures do make clear that the resurrected Jesus Christ has a glorified body that is able to miraculously appear and disappear, and is even unrecognizable to many who knew him well, such as Mary Magdalene and the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. However, St. Luke adds the interesting detail of Jesus Christ eating food with the disciples, and Jesus Christ proves he is the same by showing his wounds to Thomas. Gandalf is unrecognizable to his friends, but only 3 of them and only for a moment. Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn do not recognize him at first, but no other characters have this trouble. The effects of resurrection seem to have been the opposite for Jesus Christ and Gandalf. Jesus Christ is somehow physically changed, but his character remains the same, whereas Gandalf is hardly changed physically, but as the story progresses, we learn of more and more subtle differences in his character. Jesus Christ may have been the inspiration for Gandalf, but he certainly is not the model. We thus have 2 competing conceptions of the character of Gandalf. How are we to reconcile them? How does Gandalf's humanity influence his Christ-like heroism, and vice versa? I do not believe they are at odds with each other. It is a well-established trope in literature that the hero has a fatal or potentially fatal flaw that he either succumbs to or overcomes in the course of the story. What is Gandalf's fatal flaw? What does he overcome throughout the course of the story? Saruman's betrayal catches Gandalf off his guard, allowing Saruman to imprison him. Gandalf only escapes by sheer luck. He is outwitted because of a failure to notice the downfall of Saruman. He knew of Saruman's obsession with the Rings of Power and his study of the dark magic of the enemy. He tells Frodo that Saruman's knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven Rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it. Gandalf respects Saruman's knowledge and authority, even though he notices flaws. He naively trusts in the sincerity and goodness of Saruman. He makes excuses for the vices of Saruman, ignoring the rot in Saruman's heart until evil overtakes Saruman completely. Gandalf had plenty of time to deal with Saruman before he became a problem, but Gandalf waited to see what would happen, waited for someone else to act. Another significant moment in the character arc of Gandalf is his battle with the Balrog. At the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf faces his enemy. The bridge breaks and the Balrog falls into the abyss. Gandalf turns around, but the Balrog catches Gandalf's ankle with his whip, pulling Gandalf into the pit with him. Here, as in the episode with Saruman, Gandalf underestimates his enemy. He underestimates the power of evil. He takes for granted his impunity to evil. Both failures are the result of a sort of pride, which ultimately leads to his death. We also see pride in Gandalf's constant manipulation of others. He trusts no one but himself to know the full extent of what is happening and what is at stake. Regarding this pride, we do see progress in the character of Gandalf throughout the story. Gandalf dies because of pride, but in his resurrected state, this pride seems to have been erased. Gandalf the White plays a much more secondary role in the course of events than Gandalf the Grey. He is no longer compelled to lead the charge. Instead, he turns wholly to the role of service, leaving the glory and honor to others. Gandalf still lurks in the background, but his work consists mostly of advising and encouraging. The other members of the Fellowship do most of the legwork. Gandalf's role slowly diminishes as the other members of the Fellowship grow in ability. At the end, Gandalf departs Middle-earth, leaving its affairs entirely in the hands of his companions. In the end, Gandalf conquers his pride. So Gandalf overcomes his fatal flaw. He becomes even more virtuous, which may mean he becomes even more Christ-like. To some extent, every character in The Lord of the Rings, or any work of literature who practices a virtue, can be correctly identified as Christ-like. Gandalf may have more than his fair share of virtues and good qualities, which do merit praise. Calling him Christ-like is high praise indeed. Yet this description distances Gandalf from his flaws. And flaws, however ugly, despicable, and distasteful they may be, are part of a person and crucial to understanding that person. We are deceiving only ourselves if we focus solely on a person's admirable qualities and think that we know that person. There is more. We can wonder at the human ability to create worlds and stories with characters who exhibit all the virtues and vices of real people. Art does not have to have a specific purpose or a moral to positively contribute to the richness and fullness of our lives. It can simply give us something to think about. By reflecting on the actions and development of characters such as Gandalf, we can learn something about ourselves, something about our flaws and ways to overcome them. Or we could admire a well-crafted story that is beautiful in its own right. Gandalf is a beautiful character, and The Lord of the Rings is a beautiful story. They do not have to be anything more than that. It would seem that Gandalf is not so much a white character after all. Perhaps that is the significance of his name change, a signpost to signify character development. Gandalf the Grey is not Gandalf the White. Gandalf the White says, "Indeed I am Saruman." One might almost say, Saruman as he should have been. Gandalf the White is Gandalf as he should have been. Without the gray elements of Gandalf, this transformation loses its beauty and its redemptive value. Without the gray, there can be no white.